There are three core principles as far as sustainability in agriculture is concerned. All right, great viewers out there, I want to sincerely welcome you to this episode as far as the agro real estate business is concerned. We've over some time now been carefully analyzing the profitability of integrating oil palm crop with the real estate business. I still remain Emmanuel Ogbinaka, a consultant of agriculture, specifically in soil science and land management. And I'm very much delighted to be in affiliation with Silvawell Limited. Do well to subscribe to our social media platform, our YouTube channel, so that you can have more detailed information as far as oil palm cultivation is concerned. In this episode, we are going to be discussing some interesting topic that will equip you and keep you informed in making what I will refer to as informed decision. And so quickly, we're going to be discussing on sustainable agricultural practices for long-term profitability. So we're looking at sustainable agricultural practices that we ensure that we have a continuous production and maximizing profit continuously. So first, let us quickly define what sustainable agricultural practice is. Sustainable agriculture is an approach to farming that prioritizes the long-term health and productivity of the land, as well as the well-being of the people and the community involved in the farming. When we talk about sustainable agriculture, we are looking at a holistic approach in which we are not just looking at the present gain, we are looking beyond the present and looking into the future, to ensuring that whatever gain we derive from this economic business is not just limited to the present, but transcend into future generation. Now, I want to say here that one thing I love about Silvawell Limited is the fact that the managers of this agro real estate firm have this what I call futuristic approach, not compromising the future for the present. Hence, their investment in research, their investment in synergy with other bodies that help to broaden their scope and knowledge about what it takes to put into practice sustainable approaches, as we are going to be discussing in the course of this presentation. It's no longer strange that the world as a whole is currently grappling with the challenge of climate change, environmental degradation, food insecurity. And in view of these numerous challenges, one, we want to state here that sustainable agriculture practice have become more and more crucial than ever before. Because the truth is, if we do things the way we used to do them, with the prevalence of climate change and some other environmental issues, we'll discover that the old approach is not sustainable. There are three core principles as far as sustainability in agriculture is concerned. What are these three principles that I summarize with the acronym ESE? And that is one, environmental conservation. The first principle of sustainable agriculture is environmental conservation. And then the second principle is social equity, which talks about the people. And then the third core principle of sustainable agriculture is economic viability. In other words, any agricultural practice that does not have these core principles into focus is a practice that is not sustainable. For any agricultural practice to be sustainable, it must take into consideration the environment, the people, talking about the social equity, and it must take into consideration the economic viability. That speaks of profitability. In Silvawell Limited, these three core principles is put into play in our approach, and therefore the environment is put into consideration, the people, the social factor is put into consideration, and then the profitability of our investors is also put into consideration. And this makes all the practices and approach to be what is sustainable one. Moving from there, we are looking at specifically the growing of the oil palm crop, which is integrated with the real estate. I did mention the prevailing issues in our world, not just peculiar to this part of the continent, Nigeria, but obviously world problem, the issue of climate change. I did mention the issue of environmental degradation, the issue of food insecurity. Now, if you look at these basic issues, it cuts across the three core principles of sustainable agriculture that I have mentioned. And so growing crops in plantations, just as in the case of the oil palm, cannot be completely environmentally friendly. One thing about plantation crop or plantation agriculture, that is a system in agriculture that we refer to as monocropping. And monocropping has its own side effect on the environment as a whole if some practices to checkmate those effects are not introduced. And so the plantation crops cannot completely be environmentally friendly, but however, its negative effects can be minimized through sustainable practices. And those are the core things we are going to be discussing in the course of this session. I listened somewhere about a little interview that was granted by one of the reputable oil palm firm in Edo State where we reside. And I think they were asked why the decline in yield of their oil palm production, and among other things. Now, I'm going to discuss more about this in a separate broadcast that will be purely on climate change. And one of the things that was said is the fact that there's this prevalence of new outbreak of pests and diseases, and then the issue of climate change, which is manifested in temperature and then the amount of rainfall. Like I said, we'll take time to dwell on all of this in another broadcast. Not just oil palm cultivation, but agriculture generally, in terms of yield being reduced, productivity reduced, and quality reduced, and all of those things. Though we cannot 100% overrule the possibility of climate change, we cannot 100% overrule the unfriendliness of mono system of agriculture as it is with the plantation agriculture. We can, at least to a large extent, minimize the side effect. And to do this, we need to understand sustainable practices that helps us to achieve this. Let me refer back to that interview that this reputable oil palm producing company actually mentioned. They talked about the outbreak of pest, which is this bats, outbreak of bats, which was uncommon. They've never had it in such a way, and that became a recent problem to them. The reason is not far-fetched because there is destruction of the rainforest. And when this is done, obviously the habitation of these organisms, which has become pests and problematic to the growth of the oil palm in that geographical location, becomes an issue. So the first sustainable practice is avoiding rainforest clearing. Now, of course, the plantation agriculture, like in the case of the oil palm, one will say, okay, it is a crop that requires a large expanse of land, and because of that, one will need a larger size of land to cultivate, and by this, an encroachment into the forest zone. Well, there may not necessarily be an encroachment into the forest zone to have this done. If we continue in what I refer to as deforestation, entry into the forest reserves, the rainforest zone, bringing down trees for the purpose of expansion of the plantation agriculture, in doing that, we may have immediate gain, but that practice is not sustainable because sustainability is looking at the future. You end up encroaching into the habitation of some of these organisms. And when that persists, a situation will arise whereby your crop and your plantation will become the habitation for this organism. And that is what some of these reputable agro firms that specifically deal on plantation agriculture, like the oil palm, obviously suffering from that menace. So the first sustainable practice is avoiding rainforest clearing. Deforestation, encroaching into forest reserve, like I said, is not sustainable because in the long run it has detrimental effect. Now one would now say, if that is not sustainable, then how do we go about the establishment of this plantation crop, the oil palm? Now the solution will lead us to point 2, and that point 2, which is sustainable, is the rehabilitation of abandoned and infertile lands from plantations. So instead of the encroachment into reserves just for expansion purposes that will in the long run bring detrimental effect to even our plantations, the surest way is the rehabilitation of abandoned and infertile land for plantations. And I believe that Silvawell Limited so much adopt this method in having lands that obviously fertility is improved upon, and thereby these lands are now better positioned to be used for such purposes rather than encroachment into reserves and deforestation, which has a long-term detrimental effect. The number 3 point here as regards sustainability is restraint from slash and burn practices in cultivation. Again, when we talk about sustainability, we are looking at the future. And today we are obviously aware of how the incident of climate change is adversely affecting productivity. And to checkmate this, we cannot continue to indulge in practices that will continue to affect our environment negatively. And then this old approach of what we refer to as slash and burn practices is not sustainable. As a matter of fact, the issue of bush burning is very, very highly detrimental to our environment. And so one of the ways to checkmate the incidence of climate change is a restraint on burning. The practice of burning is obviously outdated. There are sustainable ways to have your land cleared and prepared for plantation. And obviously the slash and burning as a way of controlling debris or vegetations on the land is not sustainable, in the sense that its effect is detrimental to the environment. Another sustainable practice, one that is what I would say difficult for some persons to actually abstain from or do without, and that is the minimization of chemical application. Now, I started from the introduction that some of these old or age-long practices, most of us indulge, or most farmers indulged in it, looking at the immediate gain, undermining the long-term detrimental effect. The use of chemicals, be it in the control of pests like weeds, be it in the improvement on the fertility of the soil, all of these chemicals, which is very prevalent in our operations today, is very good for immediate gain. But the truth is that it is not sustainable, especially when the application of it is excessively done. The future is not captured in its use, because the long-term utilization in excess of these chemicals again has a detrimental effect on the soil. I'll give a practical example. Some persons have come up with the complaint of what I call dangerous recent prevalence of weeds in farms that are difficult to control. Various varieties of weeds, of grasses, of plants that are difficult to control, which some of these farmers have never battled with before. And the reason for this is not far-fetched. It's simply the non-precision use of these chemicals. And this, in the long run, will change the ecology of the soil, change the ecology of the land, change the ecology of the plants, and what you have will not be plants or weeds that are highly resistant. It's just like even using the human body, for example. When a person takes a particular drug over a long period of time excessively, there's this tendency that the body becomes used to that particular drugs, and it gets to a time that when that drug is taken, you may not even see the effect of that drug. Same with the soil. And so the use of chemical, especially in excessive manner, that makes it non-sustainable. The sustainable approach is still organic approach, because again, the use of these chemicals, not only in the area of prevalence of stubborn weeds that are now difficult to be controlled by these same chemicals, it can also affect the pH of the soil. The continuous use of some of these fertilizers, which obviously contain some acidic elements, over time can make the soil become acidic. So that makes the use of chemical not sustainable. Beyond that, we could also see that if you check market survey, the market demand for organic produced crops is growing by the day, and people are getting more aware of the negative impact of genetically modified crops and excessive use of some of these chemicals for the growth of plants. So when you talk about sustainability, excessive use of chemical application is not sustainable. Another point or practice which is also a sustainable approach is what I have been hammering on in all the series of our discussion, and that is cover cropping. If you check our previous discussions, we've had enough time to actually dwell on the benefit of cover cropping. Because if you talk about sustainable agricultural practice, we are talking about practices that partner with nature, the nature way of soil replenishment. And so when you talk about cover crop, it's a sustainable way, an organic way, a natural way of one, replenishing the soil, of two, protecting the soil against the adverse effect of climate change. Because if you talk about two basic elements of climate change, you are talking about temperature, you are talking about rainfall. And cover cropping as a practice or approach helps to checkmate all of these elements. Can also help in the control of erosion and all of those factors that will lead to decline in soil fertility. The cover cropping, which is a nature way of replenishment or protecting the soil, is sustainable agricultural practice. And then we also have the crop rotation. Crop rotation is another sustainable practice. It's a practice that can be adopted to checkmate decline in fertility of the soil. It's a practice that can also be adopted to checkmate the incidence of pests and diseases. Now, one will ask me, because obviously the concept of crop rotation is to change the type of crop that is cultivated in a particular area of land over time. And one will ask, if we are dealing with oil palm here, and oil palm is a permanent crop, as we did said in our previous broadcast, and we have also established that the oil palm has a duration of at least 25 years. So how can the crop rotation play in here? Now, of course, when you also go to our previous broadcast, we also had enough time to unravel the science behind intercropping, and we did said that intercropping is a system that can be integrated with the oil palm production in a way that some other crops that are economical, some other crops that can help replenish the soil nutrient is integrated with the oil palm, especially the earlier stage of production, let's say between the first, second, and third year of establishment of the oil palm. Now, this crop rotation can't be done for such crops that are intercropped with the oil palm. So the rotation might not necessarily be for the oil palm production because it has a longer duration, but we can apply in the crops that are intercropped with the oil palm. Whether you are intercropping the oil palm plantation with plantain or with pineapple or with banana or with any other crop that you deem fit to integrate at that early stage of the cultivation, you can practice crop rotation. By this, you break the prevalence, the multiplication of a given or a particular pest in that locality. Another sustainable agricultural practice is what I refer to as precision farming techniques. The truth is that we cannot 100% eradicate the use of chemicals, but the sustainable way of using it is what our emphasis are. And that sustainable way is use to precision. By that, you avoid excessive use of such chemical. Now, precision farming techniques is an innovative, technological-driven techniques that ensure that whatever input that you are putting into your estate or your plantation is not in excess. Now, we also took time to discuss in our previous broadcast about water management. And in water management, we looked at irrigation practices. And I did say there are different methods of irrigation, the flooding method and the drip method. And I did say that one of the best methods adopted for irrigation practice is the drip method. And I explained that the drip method is preferred because it helps to conserve water. It helps you to be able to regulate the amount of water that you are introducing to your land, because you have pipes that are connected across your plant, and when there is need for watering, you can regulate the volume of water that is supplied to the land. So in precision farming techniques, even if chemicals are to be used, it is used in a way that is not excess. The amount, how many volume of the chemicals you go with a certain volume of a solvent like water that you use in diluting it. And you see a situation whereby in most smallholders, talking about the local farmer out there, most of these precision is not being followed. So you can see a situation whereby a chemical that is meant to be dissolved in 100 liters of water, for example, is dissolved in 20 liters of water. And what is in the mind of the farmer is that the more he has that chemical dissolved in little volume of water, the more he will get his effect. So again, he's concerned about the immediate result, and he's not looking at the detrimental effect of such practice in the long run. So in Silvawell, these precision farming techniques, where we understand that these chemicals have to be used with certain precision to ensure that while we benefit from them now, the future is also sustained, and the investment of our investors are also sustained. The next sustainable practice I also want to talk about is intercropping or agroforestry, which we have discussed before now in our previous broadcast. They are practices that are sustainable. They are sustainable because they put into consideration the three core principle of sustainability I mentioned earlier, and that is the environment, social equity, and economic viability. And let me go straight to the last one. Sustainable method or approach is effective farm management. Now, why sustainable agriculture? Why this method? Why use chemicals based on prescription and precision? Why minimize or eradicate or avoid the slash and burn that I talked about, or encroachment into the rainforest? Why sustainable agriculture? The reason for that is because it aims to minimize environmental impact on agricultural production and vice versa. Agricultural practice no doubt has impact on the environment, and the environment in turn has impact on agriculture. Now, the practice that are carried out in agriculture can affect the environment. And if the environment is affected negatively, then we begin to hear the incidents of climate change, environmental degradation, flooding, and all of those things. And when these things begin to happen, again, agriculture suffers, because this element of climate begin to work against productivity. And so the farmer shouldn't say that his actions or practices has no bearing with the environment. No, because his action can actually affect the environment. And when the environment is affected, his production capacity is also affected. The issue of adopting these methods that we have mentioned, and so many other methods that we call sustainable methods, reason because they put the future into focus, is the fact that we want our production to increase, and also to have a soil that is continually healthy for production to take place. So let's quickly run through the benefit of sustainable agriculture to the economy, that's profitability of the farmer, and then to the environment, and then to the people, which is the social benefit. What is the economic effect or benefit of sustainable agriculture? One, it helps the farmer to cope with climate change. Like I said, we'll devote a different time to looking at climate change. But once this practice that have been mentioned, the do's and the don'ts in our operations, as far as this plantation agriculture is concerned, if they are well adopted, it helps the farmer to cope with climate change. Like I said, the two major elements of weather or climate that we talk about in climate change is temperature and rainfall. And some of these practices that I've mentioned, they are way of checkmating deficiency in rainfall. They are way of checkmating the excessive increase in temperature. I'm talking about the cover crop, intercropping, precision farming, and all of those helps to checkmate this element of weather or element of climate. So number two economic effect is that it helps for long-term savings. What that means is that initially this method may look unrealistic, but at the long run, these sustainable methods or approaches actually help the farmer to save resources because input is going to be reduced. Take, for example, the sustainable approach of intercropping that I did mention. If this is in place, if you do a study between two farms, one intercropped and the other left bare with just the plantation crop, which is the oil palm planted, if you give these two farmers a period of time, you do your research to see how much they spend in the control of weed, you will discover that the one that didn't adopt the intercropping sustainable approach will spend more in the control of things like weed. When these sustainable methods are adopted, you could see that farm input will be reduced. The cost of fertilizer, of course, the organic method of soil replenishment by way of incorporating vegetations back into the soil instead of burning them, you have been able to successfully reduce your requirement for fertilizers, which in turn will increase the profitability of the farmer. Another economic benefit of adopting these sustainable agricultural practices is the improved product quality you stand to gain. So these sustainable practices improve product quality, because I did said that there is a great awareness among consumers of the world on the need to distance their consumption from some of these crops that have excess of these chemicals used in their growth process. A sustainable agricultural practice, like I said earlier, is a practice that works more on nature's provision for replenishment of the soil. And this is more like an organic situation. This will eventually improve the quality of product that is being harvested for people from the market for this product. Another economic effect is responding to market needs for organic food. This is what I just said. The last effect or benefit that sustainable practice can have on the farmer is maintaining soil health. There's an approach that is adopted by most of these plantation farmers, system whereby a particular land is used. After some time, then there's a shifting to another land, obviously a forested land, with the view of the fact that, oh, this land we have been using has depreciated in nutrient, let me look for a new land. That system is what we call shifting cultivation agriculture. And we are saying that it's not a sustainable system. If some of these approaches or practices are carried out, it will continuously lead to replenishment of all the vital parameters that make a soil healthy. These sustainable approaches create a situation where you have a healthy soil. And when the soil is made healthy, it means that such a soil can be used over a longer period of time. Let's look at now the environmental benefit of this sustainable approaches that we've just discussed. The environmental benefits include: one, reduce dependence on synthetic chemicals. So when you adopt precision farming technique, intercropping, crop rotation, cover cropping, and incorporating vegetations back into the soil rather than slash and burn approach, and then trying to rehabilitate used land for the purpose of oil plantation. Now, these to the environment reduce the use of synthetic chemicals. And when the use of synthetic chemicals are reduced, obviously the environment is helped, because I did say that some of these chemicals can change the ecology of weeds that you see, can also change the prevalence of pests and diseases, and can also change the pH of the soil, which is the acidity of the soil. Another benefit to the environment when these sustainable approaches are adopted is what I refer to as biodiversity. When you practice burning, when you practice this monocropping, sole cropping without intercropping it with some of these crops we have discussed about, you are just giving rise to a monotonous diversity, if I should put it that way. So one of the environmental benefits of sustainable practices is biodiversity. So when you practice no burning, and then you introduce cover cropping, and you introduce intercropping, you are creating a biodiversity scenario. Another benefit of these sustainable approaches to the environment is carbon sequestration. This has to do with the removal of carbon from the environment. One of the chemical substance that actually leads to this climate change is carbon dioxide, the CO2. And one good thing about the oil palm plantation and every other crop that will be intercropped with this oil palm plantation is the fact that they help to remove CO2 from the environment. And they do this because they carry out photosynthesis. In the process of carrying out photosynthesis, they use these gases, they absorb it from the environment. So this biodiversity scenario that have been created will lead to carbon sequestration. And then another benefit to the environment is that when these sustainable methods are used, it minimizes soil erosion and help to conserve water resources. Talk about cover cropping, talk about intercropping, talk about mulching. All of these methods, they have a way of reducing soil erosion. And this has a way of protecting the soil and protecting the land and protecting the fertility of the land. And also these approaches also help to conserve water resources. When you mulch, when you adopt cover cropping, you are covering the soil from the direct heating of the sun, which will lead to evaporation. So once the soil is shielded, it reduces the amount of heat reaching the soil, and this will help to conserve water. We have to conserve moisture, and this will save you stress of having to introduce more water to that given area. And then lastly, what is the benefit of these sustainable approaches to the social aspect, the social equity, talking about the people want there's stable and sustainable jobs? This is because agriculture still remains one of the strongest, biggest sector that create employment for our youth, for our aged, for our people. And so if practices that are detrimental to the soil are allowed to thrive, you will have a situation whereby these resources will not be available for agricultural purposes. And when this happens, you want to imagine how many persons will be jobless. And so sustainable approaches create sustainable jobs by way of agricultural practice to our population. Another social benefit is reduce unemployment. Reduce unemployment, like I've just said. So when you adopt sustainable approaches, you are going to create sustainable jobs and sustainable employment for the teeming population. It's one of the social benefits of this approach, this sustainable method we talk about. And then another social benefit is food security, because there will be a situation whereby there will be continuous production. And once there's continuous production because of the favorable environment that have been created by these sustainable approaches, then there will always be food security. Number 4 is that these approaches will also promote human health. How is this possible? Through the production of healthier food. Sustainable approach, like I said, minimizing the use of chemicals. And when this is done, you have quality product produced. And when quality product is released into the market, you are guaranteed to a large extent the health of our populace. And then last but not the least of the social benefits of this sustainable techniques or approach is the preservation of resources for future generations. This is a summary of all what these sustainable practices is all about. Not just looking at the present, but adopting method practices that put the future into focus. And that is why I've always said that the choice of the agro real estate and all of these things we are discussing by Silvawell Limited is an approach that puts the future into view. It's an approach that is not just concerned about the present like every other nominal real estate business, that the attention is just in the now, the immediate gain without the future in focus. So in conclusion, I want to say that with climate posing increasing challenges to agriculture, adopting these sustainable farming practices is not just an option. If we must continue to produce and continue to improve on our ROI, our return on investment, the adoption of these sustainable practices cannot be overruled. As a matter of fact, it's not an option, but a necessity for the future of food production. I want to thank you for staying with me. I took time to refer or mention points from previous discussion. All of this you can easily access when you subscribe to our social media platform, our YouTube channel, to guide you in your decision making. Thank you until we meet again in another episode. Stay blessed.